Welcome to Spring Training, a new weekly feature of Cannon Church. I'm Tim Emmett, Senior Pastor at Cannon, and over the next 9 weeks, we'll connect the game of baseball and the Christian faith. As many of you know, I grew up north of Pittsburgh, but that was just from 6th grade on. Elementary school was spent in Ohio. We lived in Middletown, which is close to Cincinnati, and so of course, my friends and I were Reds fans, living so close to Cincinnati, but also especially because those were the years of the Big Red Machine, one of the greatest teams in baseball history. They won back-to-back World Series in 75 and 76. We knew every player in their lineup. We knew the lineup. We knew their batting averages. We knew their position on the field. I can still tell you that Johnny Bench was behind home plate. Tony Perez was at first. Joe Morgan was at second. Dave Concepcion was at short. Pete Rose was at third. Ken Griffey Sr. was in right field, Cesar Geronimo in center, and the great George Foster in left field. We all had our favorite players. We played baseball with each other in our neighborhood all summer long, and so we all would imitate our favorite players when we were at the plate, which meant for me most of the time Joe Morgan. He was my favorite player when I was young, except for 1977. In 1977, we all imitated the same player. We all wanted to be George Foster in left field. More than anything else, we wanted to be George Foster at the plate because that was the year he hit 52 home runs. He was the NL MVP. He almost won the Triple Crown that year. It was awesome watching him hit that year. And all of us wondered if he would actually break the record. It just seemed like he would never stop hitting home runs that year. In the midst of that offensive explosion, that MVP season, my parents found out that George Foster, the George Foster, was going to be at the mall in our town. And so I found myself at the mall in line with a bunch of other kids waiting for George Foster to sign a baseball for me. There are a couple things about that I remember. One was that he was kind of quiet. You know, he looked at kids and he smiled, but he wasn't talking too much. Another thing is that he was wearing a suit because it was 1977, and I guess that's just how you did things back then. Also, he was shorter than I expected. I kind of thought he would be a giant, but more than anything else, what I remember about that experience is the awe that I felt. I just couldn't believe that the George Foster was in our mall, 3 feet away, signing a baseball that he handed to me. I don't know what I would have done if he had actually talked to me and started asking me questions. I just felt so overwhelmed. I was just so awed to see him in flesh and blood right in front of me, not on my TV, right in front of me. You know, faith begins with awe. Sometimes faith begins with fear. That's a real pathway into faith, a real way that sometimes faith begins. A friend of mine in college named Dave Vossler talked about coming to faith when he was in high school because he saw a presentation on the book of Revelation and it literally scared him into faith in Jesus. He was terrified by the prospect of judgment. He said I've never seen so much fire in my life, and it kind of just scared him into faith in Jesus. Sometimes faith begins with fear. Sometimes faith begins with need. We come to a crisis in our life and we know we need God, and so we reach out to God and faith is born. A friend told me a story about a friend of hers who was an atheist, did not believe in God, did not believe in Jesus. But she was diagnosed with cancer and it was late stage. And out of her desperation, she cried out to God and she was healed. And that was the beginning of faith for her. Sometimes faith begins with fear. Sometimes faith begins with us and our need. But I want to suggest to you that if we want a faith that endures, a faith that empowers, a faith that matures, that can sustain us through the whole of our lives, what we really need is a faith that begins and is empowered by awe. It's the experience of being just overwhelmed by the presence and grace and love of God. We find in the Bible, if you read the Gospels, that people are really just undone when they're in the presence of Jesus. They're overwhelmed by his presence, his grace, his mercy, and his love. The Gospel writers tell us all the time that people were astonished and amazed. One of my favorite stories is of a man named Zacchaeus, a tax collector, which really made him a traitor to his own people. He hears that Jesus is coming to his town, and so he goes out with many others to see Jesus. He just kind of wants to get a glimpse of him, but he's a short man, so he climbs a tree to look over the crowds and see Jesus. And you may know the story that when Jesus, kind of passing through with his disciples, sees Zacchaeus in the tree, he stops, looks at him, and says, "Come down, I'm going to your house today." Mind-blowing, astonishing, and transforming for Zacchaeus. he immediately changes the direction in his life. As a wealthy tax collector, he really has exploited people. He's taken what doesn't belong to him, and he immediately says, I'm giving back what I've taken that does not belong to me. He was overwhelmed by Jesus. For him, faith began with awe inspired by grace. My question for you today is this: what's fueling your faith right now? It could be fear. It could be need. And those are both perfectly, kind of good pathways into faith. But the faith that endures, the faith that empowers, the faith that will really grow with you through the whole of your life is a faith that begins with awe. And so if you have a faith that's fueled by fear or by need, I'd encourage you to pray for a faith that begins and is fueled by awe. We want to be overwhelmed, undone in a good way by the love and grace and mercy of God. That's That's episode 1 or inning 1 of spring training. We'll see you next week for inning 2.